Hey folks, now one of the popular trends on the internet right now is this Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson. Now, he, did an interview, he has a podcast, and he is very critical of what people call the PC culture on the campuses these days, feminism, and such. And, some people disagree with him, some people agree with him. I disagree with him fundamentally. And the point that I want to point toward as my most fundamental point of disagreement is actually one that gets a little bit overlooked. Most people that criticize Jordan Peterson criticize him in relation to feminism or transgender issues and such. I'm going to focus really on the crux of the problem with his argument, the underlying ideological problem. Now, essentially, he argues that hierarchy is natural. Now, what is hierarchy? That's a word that gets thrown around. Well, hierarchy is when human beings organize society in a way in which individuals are placed above individuals. That's called hierarchy, when individuals are placed above others. Now, his argument is, he says, look at lobsters. He says lobsters have hierarchies. Some lobsters are in charge of other lobsters. Lobsters have serotonin in their brains. Antidepressants work on lobsters. So therefore, hierarchy is just natural. And that people just naturally have this order where some are above others. And that's just the natural way. That's just human nature. That's the way people are. And so, he goes further to argue that when the left tries to make women have a higher level of equality with men, or when they try to make things more egalitarian, that's just getting in the way, because there's this natural order that exists, and the problem is people toying with it, and that's pointless, and there's a natural order. That's the argument that he makes. And the argument is problematic and essentially fallacious for the following reason. Yes, human beings, like other species, have the ability built into their DNA in order to create hierarchy. That is correct. And if you look throughout human history, you'll see hierarchies. But you'll notice these hierarchies are not the same. Through most of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers, we lived in tribes, maybe 30 people, 25 to 30 people. We hunted and we gathered, and there was probably a level of hierarchy in those tribes, but it was pretty egalitarian. No one was exploiting anybody else, but you can bet there was quite an authoritarian way of doing things, with a life expectancy of like 25 or 30. People had to be very disciplined, and even any sense of individuality probably didn't exist. People's whole identity was with the tribe and with the group. They probably didn't even have a sense of themselves as individuals. And if you look at then, under feudalism, the next social order, there was a very different form of hierarchy, where you had, serfs and landlords and nobles and people that were the property of other people, and land and hereditary titles. That was a very different form of hierarchy. You can look at the hierarchy that exists today, where some people own major industries and corporations and oil wells and banks and factories, and the rest of us sell our labor power in order to survive, where we have presidents and governments and that kind of thing. Again, this is a different form of hierarchy. And if you look throughout the history of civilization, human beings do form hierarchies, but they do it in response to material conditions. And as technology develops, and as the way we interact with nature develops, the nature of the hierarchies that we produce changes. And that the nature of these hierarchies, it becomes looser based on a rising level of abundance. No one in the world talked about human rights or freedom or dignity or individual liberty until, the 1400s. People weren't talking about that because the level of material abundance to facilitate that form of civilization with a looser form of hierarchy in which people could have individual rights, that didn't exist. It was based on a material level of abundance. And this is what's missing. When he tries to argue that there's just some natural order, and that there's this natural way of doing things, and that human beings just naturally operate in a certain way, what he's missing is that hierarchy is a response to certain conditions. Human beings have the ability to run in order to survive. That's one thing that we have, is we have the ability to run. We don't run all day long. We run when we need to, or we feel like it, right? That human beings create hierarchies in response to specific conditions, and that as material abundance rises, and as stability rises, those hierarchies become looser, or just different, And so the thrust of his argument, it's a very right-wing ideological argument. It's this idea that, that there's this natural way of being, men are one way, women are one way, there's this natural order, and that we're wasting our time trying to change it, and that there's just this natural way of being. And he's not correct. All throughout the history of human civilization, you'll see human society organized very differently to serve different specific needs. His argument is not rooted in materialism. His argument, serves a kind of very far right-wing social conservatism, the kind of thing you find in the writings of Julius Evola or Oswald Spengler. This kind of this argument that the problem isn't that people are oppressed, or it isn't that people don't have the needs that they need. It isn't that we're holding back social progress. His argument is essentially that the problems are all introduced by efforts to make things more fair and equal, and that the problem is that people are toiling or meddling. People are meddling in the natural way of doing things. That's his argument. And it's quite a dangerous argument, and it leads to some quite dangerous things. The reality is that hierarchies do exist and will exist for a long time, but they will change and adapt and probably be loosened as material abundance develops, and that hierarchies are a response to material conditions. That's what's missing from his analysis.